Wyoming Territory, 1879. The wind carried the scent of pine and dust when the cowboy rode into Elk Hollow with a bruised sky behind him and wildflowers tucked under his saddle horn. Grace Ellery did not look up right away when she heard hooves. She was crouched by the porch of her small, clapboard home, brushing dust from the hem of her skirts, the late afternoon sun catching the pale gold in her brown hair. She was not expecting anyone. Not today. Miss Grace, came the familiar drawl, low and warm. She stood slowly, heart thumping like it always did when she heard that voice. Beckett Granger, she said, squinting at him as he dismounted. You are 2 days early. He grinned, but not in the reckless way most cowboys did. His was quieter, steadier. There was dirt on his boots and 3 days' ride in his shoulders, but his hand held her a bouquet of bright wildflowers, Indian paintbrush, purple asters, sunflowers. I promised I'd bring you these every time I left town, he said, handing them to her. She took them gently, blinking a little too fast. You keep your promises better than most. I keep all of them, he said, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Beckett had been riding in and out of Elk Hollow for over a year now, driving cattle for the Summers brothers up near the Snake River. He passed through town when he left, and again when he returned. And every time, he stopped by Grace's house. The first time, she had just moved there, a widow with 2 small children and no intention of letting another man into her heart. But Beckett never asked for anything, just brought her wildflowers, helped her chop wood when he could, taught her son how to tie proper knots, and helped her daughter build a fence for her chickens. He never lingered too long, but he never stayed away too long either. How are the kids? He asked, tying his gelding to the hitch. Graham is at the creek, fishing. Georgia is helping Mrs. Tally with pie crusts. Said she wants to be a baker now. He chuckled. What happened to being a horse doctor? She said horses do not smell nice. Beckett laughed, full and warm, and Grace looked away quickly, pretending to adjust the flowers in the tin can on the porch rail. The sun was setting now, laying gold light across his shoulders, and for a moment she wished she could freeze time. You had supper yet? She asked. No, ma'am. Then you are staying. He nodded, brushing dust off his hat. Yes, ma'am. Later, after the children were home and supper was done, Beckett sat on the porch steps whittling a piece of pine. Grace was just inside, drying dishes. Through the open window, she could hear Georgia asking questions about cattle and Graham bragging about catching a trout as big as a wagon wheel. She stepped outside, arms folded against the cool air. You always bring flowers, she said quietly. Why? Beckett looked up at her. Because I know what it feels like to be left behind. Her breath caught. My ma died when I was 12. Pa left the next winter. I stayed on with my uncle, but he was not much for kindness. I learned early that when people ride out, they do not always come back. He paused. So when I leave, I want you to know I intend to return. She sat beside him, close enough that her shoulder brushed his. Beckett. He turned to her, and for a moment, the quiet between them was thick with things unsaid. His hand, rough and warm, brushed against hers. I would not mind if you stayed, she said, voice barely above a whisper. He looked at her, eyes dark and soft. I have one more trail to ride, one more job to finish. Then I will come back, Grace. For good. She nodded slowly. You always say that. This time, I mean to prove it. Beckett left 3 days later, early in the morning. Georgia gave him a piece of pie wrapped in cloth. Graham gave him a lucky rock. Grace stood on the porch, arms crossed tight, watching him ride out with a bouquet of wildflowers tucked into his saddlebags. He turned in the saddle, raised a hand. I will be back before the frost. You better be, she called. Then he was gone. The weeks rolled on. Grace kept busy sewing, cooking, mending fence. The children grew louder, taller, stronger. But the house felt quiet without Beckett's boots by the door, his deep voice in the evenings. One night, a storm rolled in. Rain pelted the roof. Wind shook the windows. Grace sat by the fire, staring at the flames, heart tight with worry. She had not heard from him in over a month. 2 more weeks passed. Then 3. Then one morning, a rider came thundering into town, shouting for help. A cattle drive had gone bad up near the Wind River Range. Stampede. Injuries. The name Beckett Granger was among those missing. Grace's knees buckled. She left the children with Mrs. Tally and rode out alone, through the rain and wind, through 3 days of rough trail, until she reached the summer's camp. The foreman confirmed that Beckett had gone after a lost calf during the storm and never returned. Grace did not wait. She packed a satchel, mounted her horse, and followed the tracks herself. She found him 2 days later, half buried in a gulch, leg broken, feverish and weak. "Beckett," she whispered, dropping to her knees beside him. His eyes opened slowly. "Grace, I am here," she said, voice shaking. "You are not dying. Do you hear me?" He stared at her like he was afraid to blink. "I told you I would come back." She pressed her forehead to his. "You did. But this time, I came for you." It took 6 days to get back to town. She stayed by his side, kept him warm, fed him, cleaned his wounds. He never let go of her hand. And when they finally returned, with the children running out to meet them and the town turning out to help, Beckett pulled her aside. He reached into his saddlebag. "Grace Ellery," he said, voice hoarse and eyes fierce. "I brought you wildflowers every time I left town." She nodded, tears burning. "But this time," he said, pulling out a simple gold ring, "I brought something else." She stared at it, then at him. "You sure?" "I have been sure since the first time you opened your door." She stepped into him, wrapped her arms tight around his neck. "Then yes." He kissed her, slow and sure, right there in the middle of the road, while the children laughed and the wind carried petals from the bouquet, still tied to his saddle. And for the first time in years, Grace felt like she was home. Beckett woke to the scent of flour and lye soap, sharp and honest. The cot creaked under his weight as he shifted, blinking into the dim morning light that seeped through the curtains. The pain in his leg was still there, a dull throb beneath the splint, but it no longer dragged him under. Grace sat at the far end of the room, her sleeves rolled to the elbow, hair pinned up with a pencil. She was darning one of George's stockings, her needle moving with steady precision. She hadn't noticed he was awake. "You always work this early?" His voice came out rougher than he meant. She didn't startle, just looked up and set the stocking aside. "Only when I can't sleep." He tried to sit up straighter and failed. She crossed the room and helped him ease back against the pillows, her touch careful but sure. "Didn't mean to wake you." "You didn't," she said. "You were talking in your sleep." Beckett frowned. "What was I saying?" Grace poured him a mug of warm water, pressing it into his hands. "Something about a mule and a sack of beans. I stopped listening after that." He chuckled, then winced. "I don't remember any mule. You were also trying to saddle a tree." He shook his head, smiling faintly. "Sounds about right." She settled into the chair beside him, folding her hands over her lap. "Dr. Kellum came yesterday. Said the leg's healing straight. You'll walk again, but not for another month, maybe more." He met her gaze. "I'll work for my keep." Her brow lifted. "I didn't ask you to." "I know, but I'd like to." Grace looked away, the morning sun brushing the side of her cheek. "I set up a cot in the shed, once you can manage stairs. You'll have your own space." He hesitated. "You want me in the shed?" "I want you recovering somewhere that doesn't smell like drying herbs and stove polish." He looked around the room, finally noticing the bundles of yarrow and chamomile strung along the beams, the copper kettle simmering on the back stove. "It does have a fragrance." She stood and picked up the stocking again. "Graham's been asking when you'll be well enough to teach him how to ride bareback." Beckett raised an eyebrow. "I never promised him that." "You should have heard the way he told it. Said you once rode a Mustang with nothing but a rope and a prayer." "Sounds like something I'd regret." Grace's mouth twitched. "He carved you something. Won't let me see it." Beckett leaned back into the pillows, letting silence stretch between them. "You always take care of everyone else." She looked at him, hard and unreadable. "That's what needs doing. Anyone ever take care of you?" Grace didn't answer right away. She tied off a thread, set the stocking aside, and stood. "I'll bring you broth before the noon sun hits. Try not to pick a fight with the cat while I'm gone." He watched her go, the door swinging gently behind her, and let out a breath that wasn't quite a sigh. That afternoon, Graham burst in with a carved horse wrapped in cloth. The boy's hands were stained from creek clay, and his boots tracked mud across the floorboards. He grinned wide as he handed it over, then launched into a detailed explanation of how he'd shaped the mane with his penknife. Beckett turned the figure over in his hands, marveling at the detail. "You did this yourself?" Graham nodded proudly. "Mama said you should have something to remind you of the trail, since you can't ride it." Beckett's voice caught a little. It's perfect. Later, Georgia crept in with a bundle of dried lavender tucked behind her back, which she insisted be placed under his pillow to keep away fever dreams. Beckett thanked her solemnly. She informed him that if he died, she'd haunt him. That night, Grace lingered on the porch long after the children had gone to bed. Beckett watched her from the window, the way the breeze tugged loose strands of her hair, the way her shoulders drew tight, like she was holding something in. He couldn't stand, not yet, but he could speak. You scared me, he said quietly from the doorway. She didn't turn. You scared me first. I didn't mean to get lost. I followed the calf too far, thought I could make it back before the rain set in. You could have died out there, she said, voice soft and taut. I didn't. She finally turned, her eyes shining in the moonlight. I don't want to bury anyone else, Beckett. He held her gaze. You won't. Not me. Grace stepped forward, slow and cautious, until she stood before him at the threshold. You don't know that. No, he admitted. But I know I'd rather break every bone in my body than leave you wondering again. She reached up and touched his face, just once, fingers brushing lightly against his jaw. Then don't make promises you can't keep. He took her hand and held it there. I don't. The porch creaked beneath her boots as she leaned in, forehead resting lightly against his. A long breath passed between them, neither of them speaking. And in that hush, with the stars above and the earth still damp from yesterday's rain, Grace Ellery let herself hope. The first snow came early that year. Not in thick drifts, but a fine, steady dusting that softened the edges of everything it touched. Elk Hollow fell quiet beneath it, boots tracked slower, voices dropped lower, and smoke curled higher from chimneys. Beckett had nearly made it to the porch unassisted. He leaned on a cane Graham had carved from willow, still raw in places where the bark peeled. Each step was deliberate, but his balance held. Grace stood beside him, eyes narrowed, watching the way his left foot dragged just slightly. You're favoring it. I'm walking on it. That's different. He eased himself into the rocking chair she'd dragged out earlier that morning, breath fogging in the cold. You always this encouraging? She handed him a cup of boiled chicory. Only when I like someone. Beckett took it with both hands, warming his fingers against the tin. That explains a lot. She didn't answer, just leaned against the rail and looked out across the yard. The fence Georgia had helped build sagged a little where one of the corner posts had shifted. A pair of hens pecked at the frozen ground near the shed. Graham asked if you were staying through winter, she said after a while. I will if you'll have me. She didn't look at him. I already said yes. I meant more than just the season. Grace turned to face him, her arms folded. You still plan to take up work in the spring? I won't ride the long drives anymore, he said. I was thinking of buying in with Jess Lohman. He's looking to expand his herd, and he needs someone with trail experience. It wouldn't take me far. And the rest of the time? Beckett met her eyes. Here. If you'll have me for that, too. She didn't answer right away. The wind stirred her skirt around her ankles, and her fingers tightened at the fold of her arms. I don't want to keep you from what you're meant for. You're what I'm meant for. Her expression didn't change, but she stepped closer, reached for the edge of his scarf, and adjusted the fold near his neck with quiet care. You always say the right thing. I only say what's true. That night, Beckett sat by the fire with Georgia curled against his good side, her head resting quietly on his arm. She was half asleep by the time Grace finished turning down the lamps. She's stubborn, Beckett said softly. She gets it from her father, Grace answered, smoothing the girl's braid. He was a kind man, but he never stayed in one place too long. Beckett looked at her, not moving. Do you think that's what I'll do? Grace knelt beside the hearth, feeding the embers with a pine branch. I did. At first. But I don't anymore. He set a hand on her shoulder. I don't know what kind of husband I'd make. But I know I'd never leave again. She looked up at him, her face lit orange by the firelight. I don't need a perfect man, Beckett. I need someone who stays. I'm here, he said. I'm staying. Later, when the house had gone quiet and the fire had burned low, Grace found the ring again. It sat on the shelf above her bed, tucked into a little cedar box. She opened it without sound, ran her thumb over the smooth band. It wasn't ornate, just a circle of gold, warm from the room. She didn't put it on yet. Instead, she climbed beneath the quilt, listening to the wind move outside, and thought of the way he'd looked earlier on the porch steadying himself, reaching for nothing but the doorframe, shoulders squared against the cold. In the morning, she rose early and made biscuits with milk and lard, just enough for 4. When Beckett came tapping the floor, she handed him a plate without a word. He sat, broke one biscuit in half, and passed it to Georgia without waiting to be asked. Grace watched him, eyes lingering on the way he moved through the room like he'd always belonged there. Later that week, he hitched the mule and helped her haul wood from the clearing behind the house. She watched him from the kitchen window as he loaded the sled, the muscles in his back shifting beneath his worn shirt, the quiet rhythm of his work as familiar now as her own breath. He didn't bring wildflowers anymore. The frost had taken them. But that didn't matter. He was here, not just in body, but in the way he carved a new latch for the pantry, the way he taught Graham to oil the rifle, the way he let Georgia braid his hair one evening when the snow fell too thick for chores. One night, when the wind howled down the chimney and the children lay asleep in the loft, Grace reached into the cedar box and took out the ring. Beckett was sitting by the hearth, mending his boot with a curved needle, the firelight catching in his hair. She walked over, held the ring out, palm open. "I don't want a wedding with lace and speeches," she said. "But I want you. Here. With us." He set the boot down, looked up at her, and took the ring. "I've only ever wanted you." She held out her hand, and he slid the ring onto her finger with a tenderness that made her knees go weak. No fanfare, no vow spoken aloud, just the hush of snow outside and the fire's breath between them. She rested her head on his shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her waist, pulling her close. It wasn't a beginning, not exactly. It was the middle of something strong and quiet and lasting. And Grace Ellery, once alone and braced against the world, let herself lean into it fully. The river behind the Ellery place froze solid by the second week of December. Mornings came silver and brittle, breath rising in clouds as Beckett walked the fence line with Graham, testing posts inch by inch. His leg held better now, though he still carried the cane out of caution more than need. Grace had noticed he no longer favored it when he knelt to check for loose wire, and he hadn't mentioned pain in over a week. One afternoon, the wind settled and the sky cleared to a pale, sharp blue. Grace stood at the edge of the property, eyes on the north pasture. She held a letter in one hand, the paper already creased from her fingers. Beckett approached quietly, stopping when he saw her expression. "You get news?" he asked. She nodded, folding the letter slowly before turning to face him. "My aunt passed, the one in Nebraska. She raised my mother's youngest sister after the war." "I'm sorry," he said, voice low. "She wrote me once every winter. Always sent dried apples in the envelope," Grace said. "Georgia used to think it was magic." "You thinking of going back for the funeral?" Grace shook her head. "It's too far, and she'd understand. She wrote that she hoped I'd found peace. Said it wasn't something many women got." Beckett didn't answer right away. He looked out over the pasture, where the last of the dry grass poked through the snow like brittle thread. "She wasn't wrong," he said finally. That night, after the children were settled and the lamps turned low, Grace pulled her sewing chair closer to the hearth, where Beckett sat oiling the hinges of the cellar door. The fire popped behind them, throwing light against the floorboards. "Were you ever married before?" she asked, carefully threading her needle. Beckett looked up. "No, ever come close. I thought I had once. A girl in Montana. Her father owed my uncle a debt. There was talk of a trade between families." He snapped the hinge closed, wiped the excess oil from his fingers. "She left before any promises were made. Took what cash she could and rode south. I never blamed her." Grace tied off a stitch. "You ever write her?" "No. I didn't know how to say what I felt then. I barely do now. I'd argue you've learned." He glanced at her, something steady in his gaze. "You make it easier." The next morning, Grace sent Graham to town with a list of supplies and a warning not to linger near the saloon. Georgia stayed behind, helping Beckett stack firewood in the shed. Grace watched from the kitchen window, noting how he paused every so often to listen when Georgia spoke, never rushing her, never correcting. When he came inside, cheeks red from the cold, he found Grace in the pantry, sorting jars of preserves. "Georgia asked if we'd be having a wedding supper," he said. Grace raised an eyebrow. "And what did you tell her?" "That I'd ask her mother." She turned, brushing her hands on her apron. "You want something formal?" "I want something honest. Doesn't have to be big." Grace considered that. then reached for a jar of pickled beets. I suppose I could ask Mrs. Tally to help bake. She's been itching for an excuse to use that new pie tin she bought from the peddler. Beckett stepped closer, voice gentler now. Only if you want it. Grace looked up at him, the pantry dim but warm. I do. The wedding supper took shape over the next week. No invitations were sent, but word spread fast in Elk Hollow. Mrs. Tally brought jars of blackberry preserves and a ham she'd smoked herself. The preacher rode in from 2 homesteads over, his coat patched at the elbows and his Bible wrapped in oilcloth. A neighbor lent a fiddle, and someone filled a jug with corn whiskey that made the rounds before the sun had even touched the ridge. They stood under the eaves of the porch, Beckett in a clean shirt and his father's old suspenders, Grace in her mother's shawl with the embroidery at the hem. Georgia held a bouquet of pine branches and dried lavender. Graham stood tall, chin lifted, as if daring anyone to call it anything less than fine. When the preacher asked if Grace took Beckett as hers, she didn't hesitate. When he asked the same of Beckett, the cowboy didn't look at the sky, or the guests, or the preacher. He looked only at Grace. I already do. That night, after the neighbors had gone and the children were asleep, Beckett found her on the porch swing, blanket across her lap. He sat beside her without a word, their shoulders touching. After a long moment, Grace spoke, voice low. I never thought I'd marry again. I never thought I'd be enough for someone like you. She leaned into him, her head resting where his shoulder met his chest. You are. He wrapped an arm around her and pulled her close. The wind had died. The sky above them was clear and full of stars, and for the first time in a long time, the world felt still. Beckett reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something small. He placed it in her hand. It was a sprig of dried Wildflowers Indian paintbrush, brittle now, but still red. There weren't any fresh, he said. She held it carefully, thumb brushing its stem. They're perfect. He kissed the top of her head, slow and certain. And inside the house, the fire burned low, warm and unhurried, waiting for them to come in. The thaw came slow that spring. Days stretched longer, but the ground still held firm beneath frost in the mornings. Grace stood in the lean-to beside the house, rubbing linseed oil into the handle of a broken rake. Her sleeves were rolled to the elbow, and fine lines of dirt traced the ridges of her knuckles. She worked without hurry, the way she always did when her mind was busy. Beckett stepped through the doorway, wiping his hands on a rag. I ran lines to the north field. There's good water under the creek bed, might be worth starting potatoes there. Grace looked up. That's rocky ground. I can clear it. Georgia said she'd help if we let her name the mule. Grace leaned her hip against the workbench, smiling faintly. She'll name it something ridiculous. She already has. She's calling him Reverend. She's 10. She's stubborn. Grace set down the rake handle and crossed the shed to where he stood, her gaze searching his face. You mean to stay through planting season? I meant to stay for the rest of my life. She didn't answer right away. Her hand reached for his, fingers curling around his palm. This land isn't easy. I'm not looking for easy. Most men say that and leave when the fence breaks twice in a month. I'll fix it 3 times. She stepped closer, resting her forehead against his chest. He wrapped both arms around her, and they stood that way for a while, the scent of sunlight and sawdust thick in the air. By the second week of April, Graham had started leaving his bedroll rolled up on the porch, claiming the night air helped him think. Georgia took to digging rows behind the barn and consulting Grace on what seeds could be saved. The house felt fuller, not from noise but from the shape of life settling into its corners. One morning, while Beckett and Graham drove fence posts near the edge of the cottonwoods, Grace carried a basket of eggs across the yard and found Georgia crouched by the side gate, arms folded tight. Something wrong? Grace asked, crouching beside her. Georgia pointed toward the road. A man came by while you were out. Said he was looking for Beckett. Grace's mouth tightened. Did he say why? Said he was from the Loman Ranch. Grace set the basket down gently. Thank you for telling me. She waited until the children were busy before walking out to the fence line. Beckett saw her coming and handed the post driver to Graham, stepping away to meet her. There was a man here, she said. Said he was from Jess Loman's. Beckett nodded slowly. He came by last month, too. Brought papers. What kind? He wants to sell me a share in the herd. I told him no. Grace looked at him carefully. You sure? I told you I was staying. I don't need cattle to make a living here. I've got hands, and I've got you. She let out a long breath. I just wanted to hear you say it. I'll say it as many times as you need. That night, she walked into the room where he was mending a torn feed sack and sat beside him on the floor. Her voice was quiet but firm. I've been saving a piece of land. North side, just past the alder grove. Beckett looked up. Saving it for what? There's good sun there. And I've wanted to build something with a taller roof. More space. He didn't speak, just watched her. I thought we could build it together. He reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers. We'll start tomorrow. By midsummer, the frame stood tall and square, beams fitted with care, and the floor smooth beneath bare feet. It wasn't large, but Grace had chosen every inch of it. A wide window over the kitchen table, a root cellar deep enough to stay cool through August, shelves already lined with dried herbs and canned wild plum. They moved in on a warm morning, carrying their few things in baskets and crates. Georgia claimed the loft, Graham the corner room with the view of the cottonwoods. Beckett carved his initials beside Grace's in the lintel beam above the door. That evening, with the fields quiet and the porch lantern flickering low, Grace stood at the threshold, watching the last light fade. Beckett came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. You ever think we'd get here? She asked. I didn't think I'd live this long, he said. But I hoped. She turned in his arms, her hands resting on his chest. You built me a home. You gave me one. Outside, a pair of owls called from the trees. The wind moved gently through the tall grass. Grace leaned in and kissed him, slow and deliberate, the taste of sun-warmed air between them. And in that moment, there was nothing left to wait for, nothing left to fear. They had chosen each other, not once, but over and over, in every quiet moment, every shared labor, every promise kept without words. Years later, folks in Elk Hollow still talked about the house Beckett Granger and Grace Ellery built with their own hands. Not because it was grand, it wasn't, but because it stood through every storm, every hard season, every winter the creek ran high. And in that house, the children grew strong and sure. The land bore fruit. And love, slow-earned and deep-rooted, held like the beams beneath the roof.